Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lost Vale Chronicle. Before we begin, take a second to comment where you're listening from, and the exact time you're hearing this story. It's always fascinating to see where these forgotten pieces of Appalachian history travel in the middle of the night. Tonight's case isn't folklore. It isn't an urban legend. It isn't a ghost story whispered on front porches. It's a buried chapter of American history. One sealed behind the gates of a Louisiana plantation in 1845. A place where beauty hid brutality, where a forbidden bloodline took root in secret, and where the murder of a beautiful young slave named Émile exposed a truth so dangerous it crossed oceans to find him. Dim the lights. Settle in. And let's begin. The air hung heavy and wet over Belle Reve in the summer of 1845, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from humidity, the cloying scent of magnolias, and the underlying perpetual tang of sugar cane. From the grand veranda of the main house, the meticulously manicured garden stretched out like a painting, vibrant with the bloom of oleander and camellias, their colors a stark, almost mocking contrast to the muted despair that often settled upon the land. Here, beauty was a gilded cage, trapping both the captor and the captive in its intricate design. Celeste, barely 17, moved through the house with the practiced grace of a shadow, her bare feet silent on the cypress floors. She carried a tray of iced mint juleps, the soft clinking of the glasses the loudest sound in the hushed parlor where Madame Dubois entertained her visiting cousin. Celeste's eyes, dark and quick, missed nothing. She noted the way Madame's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her drink, the unnatural stillness in her usually vivacious eyes. Something was amiss, a tremor beneath the polished surface of plantation life, a discord in the carefully orchestrated symphony of oppression. The source of this disquiet, Celeste knew, was Émile. His name was whispered in hushed tones in the kitchens, debated in the fields, and spoken with a mixture of envy and fear even by the house slaves. Émile was different. He possessed a beauty that was almost ethereal, a grace that seemed to defy the brutal realities of his existence. His skin, the color of rich earth, was flawless, his eyes a startling shade of amber, framed by lashes so long they cast shadows on his high cheekbones. He moved with an innate dignity that no amount of forced servitude could extinguish. Master Dubois, a man of considerable cruelty and even greater vanity, had taken an unusual interest in Émile, elevating him from the fields to the house, where he served as a personal valet, a living ornament. This favoritism, however, was a double-edged sword, attracting both resentment and a dangerous predatory gaze. For weeks, Émile had been the subject of speculation. His usual quiet demeanor had deepened into a profound melancholy, his amber eyes often distant, haunted. He moved as if carrying an invisible burden, and the easy, almost insolent charm that had once both protected and endangered him had vanished, replaced by a profound weariness. Then, 3 days ago, he had simply disappeared. Master Dubois had raged, accusing, threatening, dispatching overseers to scour the surrounding swamps and cane fields. But his fury had a hollow ring to it, lacking the usual conviction. He spoke of runaway, of ingratitude, but Celeste saw the flicker of something else in his eyes, a fear, cold and sharp, that cut through his bluster. Madame Dubois, usually meek and submissive to her husband's will, had retreated into an almost catatonic state, her face pale, her gaze fixed on something unseen, her fingers constantly twisting a small, embroidered handkerchief. The official story, relayed through the overseers, was that Émile had escaped, but the enslaved community knew better. No runaway, however desperate, would simply vanish without a trace, without a single whisper of a plan, without a single footprint left behind. The swamps were treacherous, the patrols relentless. Émile, for all his beauty, was no fool. He understood the risks. And besides, there was the matter of his personal effects. Celeste had been tasked with tidying his small room, a cramped space in the servants' quarters, usually kept meticulously neat by Émile himself. She had found it undisturbed, his meagre possessions neatly folded, a half-finished carving of a bird on his bedside table. Nothing suggested a hasty departure. But as she smoothed the rough linen of his cot, her fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the thin mattress. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than her palm, made of dark, polished wood, unlike anything she had ever seen on the plantation. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Émile was fiercely private, guarding his few possessions with a quiet intensity. To find this box, hidden and forgotten, was deeply unsettling. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in a place like Bel Rêve, compelled her. She lifted the lid, the soft click echoing in the stillness of the tiny room. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry, nor money, nor any trinket of sentimental value. Instead, there lay a single, meticulously folded piece of parchment. It was old, brittle at the edges, and covered in elegant script that Céleste, who could only read a few basic words, recognized as French, but of a style far older and more refined than the everyday letters Master Dubois received. More arresting than the script itself was the small, intricately drawn crest at the top of the page, a lion, rampant, crowned, holding a fleur-de-lis. This was no ordinary runaway's possession. This was a document of immense significance, a piece of a world far removed from the suffocating confines of Bel Rêve. As Céleste carefully refolded the parchment, her fingers brushed against something else within the box, tucked beneath the velvet lining. It was a tiny dried flower, pressed flat, its petals a faded indigo. And beneath the flower, a lock of hair. Not the curly hair of Émile, but fine, pale blonde, almost silver, tied with a thin silk ribbon. A shiver, colder than any swamp mist, traced its way down Céleste's spine. Émile's secret was not just a secret, it was an impossible one. It spoke of a life, a lineage, a connection utterly incompatible with his status as a slave on a Louisiana plantation. And if Master Dubois or anyone else were to discover this, it would not merely cause a stir. It would shatter the very foundations of Bel Rêve, and perhaps the entire world they knew. The whispers had begun, but the truth, Céleste realized, was far more dangerous than any rumor. It was a truth that could change everything, and it was now hidden in her trembling hands, a silent promise of upheaval. The small, intricately carved box felt impossibly heavy in Céleste's hands. A Pandora's box whispered into being amidst the stifling silence of Émile's empty room. The parchment with its regal crest, the faded indigo flower, the lock of pale, almost silver hair. Each item was a shard of a shattered mirror, reflecting a life utterly unimaginable for a man enslaved on Bel Rêve. Her fingers trembled as she placed them back within their velvet nest, snapping the lid shut with a soft, final click. This was not merely a secret. It was a truth so profound, so dangerous, that it felt like a living thing, squirming in the confines of the wooden box. She knew she could not keep it there. If Master Dubois's men, in their increasingly desperate search for Émile, were to discover this, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Émile, wherever he might be, but for anyone found to be in possession of such an item. It spoke of a world beyond the plantation, of a history that defied the very chains that bound them all. Céleste quickly tucked the box deep within her own meagre belongings, beneath a loose floorboard in her shared quarters, a place she hoped no one would think to search. The act felt like a betrayal, yet also a desperate act of preservation. She was now a keeper of Émile's impossible secret. The sun climbed higher, relentlessly beating down on the cane fields, baking the earth and the air. The search for Émile continued, but with a growing sense of futility. The overseers, their faces grim under wide-brimmed hats, returned each evening with nothing but sweat and mosquito bites. Master Dubois's rages became more frequent, his threats more vicious, but there was a brittle edge to his anger now, like a glass about to shatter. Madame Dubois remained in her spectral state, her eyes hollow, her hands perpetually clasped, as if in silent prayer or desperate supplication. The entire plantation held its breath, waiting for an answer, dreading what that answer might be. The answer came 2 days later, not with a whisper, but with a scream carried on the humid afternoon breeze. Celeste was in the kitchen, shelling peas, when the sound ripped through the air, a raw, guttural cry of horror and disbelief. It came from the direction of the southern cane fields, the area closest to the swamp, where the cane grew thickest and tallest, a dense, green wall that could swallow a man whole. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the kitchen staff. The cook, a formidable woman named Auntie May, dropped her ladle with a clatter. "Go, Celeste," she urged, her voice tight with fear. "Go see what it is. Be quick, but be careful." Celeste ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She followed the other house slaves, a terrified throng drawn by the siren call of catastrophe. The path led them deeper into the maze of sugar cane, the stalks towering over their heads, their sharp leaves rustling like 1,000 whispers. The air grew heavier, thick with the cloying sweetness of the cane, and a new metallic tang that Celeste instinctively recoiled from. They found him near the edge of a small, stagnant pool of water, almost hidden by the dense undergrowth. A small group of eld hands, their faces ashen, stood frozen around the discovery. The scream, Celeste now realized, had come from young Thomas, barely 10 years old, who stood rigid, pointing a trembling finger. It was Émile. His beautiful face, once so alive with its striking amber eyes and subtle, knowing smile, was now contorted in a silent rictus of horror. His skin, usually the color of rich earth, was mottled and bruised, his clothes torn and caked with mud. A dark, ugly stain bloomed across the front of his shirt, a stark contrast to the vibrant green of the surrounding cane. His body lay twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out as if in a last, desperate reach. The silence that followed Émile's discovery was profound, broken only by the buzzing of flies already beginning their grim work. The air, heavy with the scent of decay and fear, seemed to press down on Celeste, stealing her breath. This was no runaway. This was murder. Master Dubois arrived quickly, his face a mask of furious indignation that barely concealed a deeper, more primal shock. He barked orders, his voice cracking, demanding that the body be removed, that the field hands return to their work, that silence be maintained. But the facade was crumbling. Even his hardened overseers looked visibly shaken. Madame Dubois, when she was eventually brought to the scene by her maid, let out a soft, keening wail before collapsing into a dead faint, her embroidered handkerchief still clutched in her hand. Celeste stood rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on Émile's lifeless form. The impossible secret in the wooden box burned in her mind. The parchment, the flower, the blonde hair. What did they mean now? Were they the key to this horror? Had Émile been killed because of what he knew, or because of who he truly was? The dark stain on his shirt, the unnatural twist of his body, screamed of violence, not of a simple, tragic accident. Someone had wanted Émile silenced permanently. The whispers on Belle Rêve would no longer speak of a runaway. They would speak of a body in the cane field, a beautiful male slave whose secret had perhaps been too great, too dangerous to be allowed to live. And Celeste, with the wooden box hidden beneath her floorboards, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She was now a witness, privy to a truth that could unravel everything, and she knew with a chilling certainty that her own life was now inextricably bound to Émile's impossible, deadly secret. The investigation, if there even was one, would begin. But Celeste understood that the true hunt had already started, and she was already a part of it. The grim discovery of Émile's body cast a long, suffocating shadow over Belle Rêve. The official pronouncement from Master Dubois was swift and brutal. Émile, having run away, had met with a tragic accident in the treacherous cane fields. A lie, Celeste knew, as did every other soul who had seen the unnatural twist of his limbs, the dark, blossoming stain on his shirt. But Master Dubois's word was law, and the whispers of murder were quickly driven underground, replaced by a pervasive, chilling silence. Émile's body was interred in an unmarked grave at the edge of the slave cemetery, a hasty burial meant to erase not just his presence, but the questions his death provoked. Celeste carried the weight of the wooden box like a physical burden, its secrets burning beneath the floorboards of her small room. The parchment with its royal crest, the faded indigo flower, the lock of pale blonde hair, they screamed of a world incompatible with Émile's existence as a slave, a world that now, she suspected, had reached out to claim him. Every glance from Master Dubois, every strained interaction with Madame felt charged with a dangerous undercurrent. Madame Dubois in particular seemed to wither, her eyes perpetually red-rim.
Ed, her movements slow and hesitant, as if navigating a nightmare. Her silent grief, Celeste felt, was more genuine than her husband's performative outrage. The plantation settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. The field hands returned to their grueling labor, their songs muted, their faces etched with a new layer of fear. The house staff moved with exaggerated quiet, anticipating Master Dubois's unpredictable temper. The air itself seemed to hum with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of what might have been, and what now was irrevocably lost. Celeste found herself constantly scanning the faces around her, searching for answers, for any sign of who might have committed such a brutal act, and why. The identity of the killer remained a terrifying blank, but the impossible secret of Émile's past felt like the key. Then, 3 days after the burial, an unexpected arrival shattered the fragile peace. A carriage, far grander than any that usually visited Belle Rêve, rumbled up the long, oak-lined drive, its wheels kicking up dust that glittered in the afternoon sun. It was a sleek black vehicle, drawn by 2 magnificent bay horses, their coats gleaming. The driver, a stern-faced white man in a dark livery, brought the carriage to a halt before the main house with a practiced flourish. Celeste, polishing the silver in the dining room, paused, her cloth still. Such an arrival was rare, and never without significance. Master Dubois, alerted by the barking hounds, emerged onto the veranda, his usual bluster momentarily replaced by a flicker of surprise, then suspicion. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and slender, dressed in impeccably tailored black broadcloth, a stark contrast to the casual linen worn by most plantation owners in the oppressive heat. His skin was pale, his features sharp, almost aristocratic, and his eyes, a piercing shade of blue, seemed to take in everything at once. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority, a subtle power that seemed to emanate from him, instantly commanding attention. A fine walking stick, with an ornate silver handle, was clutched in one gloved hand. He was not a man of this land, Celeste realized instantly. His very presence was an anomaly. Master Dubois, despite his initial wariness, descended the steps, extending a hand, albeit with a certain stiffness. "Monsieur?" he inquired, his voice a shade less confident than usual. The stranger offered a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over the house, the grounds, and briefly Celeste, before settling back on Dubois. His voice when he spoke was low and resonant, carrying a precise, almost clipped French accent. "Monsieur Dubois, I presume. My name is Armand de Valois. I have travelled from France, on a matter of some delicacy and considerable urgency." Celeste felt a jolt of recognition, a cold prickle of alarm. France, the parchment, the crest. Her hand tightened on the silver tray she held. This man, Armand de Valois, was no ordinary visitor. "Delicacy, urgency," Master Dubois echoed, his brow furrowed. "I am afraid you have chosen a rather inopportune time. We have recently suffered a minor setback here at Belle Rêve. One of my slaves,
a particularly troublesome one, absconded. He offered a dismissive wave of his hand, attempting to reassert control. "We are still dealing with the fallout." De Valois' blue eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Indeed, I had heard rumors of an unfortunate incident. However, my purpose here is, regrettably, connected to that very individual. I am here regarding a young man known as Émile." The name hung in the air, a bell tolling a truth Master Dubois had so desperately tried to bury. Celeste watched, her breath caught in her throat, as a shadow of genuine fear crossed Dubois's face. The casual dismissal of Émile as a troublesome slave now seemed dangerously inadequate. "Émile?" Dubois stammered, his composure cracking. I don't understand. What possible connection could you have to a field hand?" Armand de Valois offered a thin, humorless smile. "My dear Monsieur Dubois, Émile was considerably more than a mere field hand. He was, in fact, a matter of significant interest to certain prominent families in France. His lineage, you see, is rather more distinguished than you might imagine." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his gaze unwavering. "I have reason to believe that Émile possessed certain documents, a family heirloom of sorts, and I intend to recover them." Celeste felt a chill deeper than any swamp mist. The wooden box, hidden beneath her floorboards, felt like a ticking bomb. This man, Armand de Valois, was clearly searching for Émile's secret, the very secret that had likely led to his death. His arrival was not merely enigmatic. It was a direct confrontation with the lie of Belle Rêve, a dangerous new player in a game that had already cost Émile his life. And Celeste, the accidental keeper of a powerful truth, was now caught squarely in its crosshairs. Armand de Valois' words hung in the humid air, a silken noose tightening around Master Dubois' neck. The casual dismissal of Émile as a mere runaway, a troublesome slave, evaporated under the Frenchman's piercing blue gaze. Dubois stammered, his usual bluster deserting him, replaced by a raw, unvarnished fear Celeste had rarely witnessed. "Distinguished lineage?" Dubois managed, a forced, nervous laugh catching in his throat. "Monsieur de Valois, you must be mistaken. Émile was purchased from an estate in New Orleans some years ago. His mother was, well, a slave. There is no lineage to speak of." He gestured dismissively towards the distant cane fields, as if the very air there would corroborate his lie. De Valois' thin smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened like chips of ice. "On the contrary, Monsieur Dubois, I assure you there is. The details of Émile's birth are, shall we say, rather more complex than a simple transaction in a New Orleans market. His mother, a woman of considerable beauty and spirit, was indeed enslaved, but her connection to a certain noble house in France was undeniable. Émile was the result of a liaison, a regrettable but significant one that held implications for the family's future." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the grand, yet ultimately provincial facade of Belle Rêve. His existence, though kept secret for many years, became known, and with it the existence of certain documents that prove his rightful place, or at least his undeniable connection to that family. Documents which I believe he carried with him. Celeste, standing motionless in the dining-room doorway, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Every word de Valois spoke was a direct echo of the items she guarded beneath her floorboards. The parchment, the crest, the blonde hair. They were not just curiosities. They were evidence, proof of a truth so potent it had brought this man across an ocean. "Documents?" Dubois repeated, his voice barely a whisper now. The colour had drained from his face, leaving it pasty and drawn. "I assure you Émile had no such things. He was a slave. What use would a slave have for such items?" "A great deal of use, Monsieur Dubois. If those items held tiki, he power to alter his fate, de Valois replied, his tone chillingly calm. Or indeed the fate of others. These documents were not merely sentimental. They contained a legal claim, however tenuous, however inconvenient, to a significant inheritance. A claim that, if made public, would cause a scandal of immense proportions in France, and potentially shift the balance of power within a very old and influential family. He took a step closer to Dubois, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. You claim Émile absconded, yet I have heard whispers of his demise. A body found in your cane fields, hastily buried. If Émile is indeed dead, Monsieur Dubois, then the circumstances surrounding his death become a matter of considerable interest to me and to those I represent. Dubois recoiled as if struck. He ran, and he met with an accident. The swamps are dangerous, the cane fields unforgiving. It was tragic, yes, but an accident, nothing more. His voice rose, desperate, cracking at the edges. De Valois simply raised an eyebrow, a gesture of profound skepticism. An accident that conveniently removed a potential claimant to a fortune? A man who, I am informed, was of exceptional beauty and intelligence, and whose presence here was, shall we say, rather highly valued by you, Monsieur Dubois? The implication was clear, cutting through Dubois's frantic denials. Celeste watched Dubois's face crumple. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own lies, now confronted by someone who knew too much. The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. De Valois was not merely seeking information. He was demanding it, backed by an authority Dubois could not comprehend, let alone challenge. Later that evening, after de Valois had been settled into the guest suite, a room usually reserved for the most esteemed visitors, and Dubois had retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy, Celeste found a moment of perilous solitude. The grand house, usually teeming with activity, felt hollow, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She crept back to her quarters, her hands shaking as she retrieved the small wooden box. She opened it again, the scent of old paper and dried petals filling the small space. She carefully unfolded the parchment. The elegant script, mostly indecipherable to her, seemed to dance with secrets. But the crest, the lion rampant, crowned, holding a fleur-de-lis, that image was now seared into her memory. De Valois had spoken of a noble house, a significant inheritance, a scandal. This crest, she now understood, was a symbol of that lineage, a silent testament to Émile's true identity. Her gaze fell upon the lock of blonde hair, almost silver. Not Émile's, she was certain. Could it be the hair of the noble father? Or perhaps the enslaved mother, if she had possessed such an unusual hue? The faded indigo flower, too, held new meaning. Was it a symbol, a memory, a clue? A shudder ran through her. Émile had been murdered not because he was a runaway, but because of this box, because of the impossible secret of his birth. And now, Armand de Valois, a man of chilling resolve, was here to reclaim that secret. He had not asked if the documents were still with Émile's body. He had simply stated his intention to recover them. He knew they existed. He knew their power. Celeste carefully returned the items to the box, her fingers brushing over the smooth wood. She was no longer just a witness to a murder. She was an unwitting participant in a dangerous game, caught between the brutal reality of Bel Rêve and the shadowy machine. Asians of a powerful French family. De Valois' arrival had not brought answers, but only deeper, more terrifying questions. The past, once merely whispered about, was now being actively uncovered, and Celeste knew with a chilling certainty that her own life depended on understanding its every dangerous detail. Armand de Valois' presence on Bel Rêve was a corrosive agent, slowly dissolving Master Dubois' carefully constructed facade of control. Dubois, usually loud and assured, now moved through his own home like a man haunted, his eyes constantly darting towards the guest suite where de Valois resided. The Frenchman, for his part, maintained a chillingly polite demeanour, yet his every inquiry, every subtle observation, felt like a scalpel probing Dubois's festering wounds. He spoke of Émile's unfortunate accident with an air of profound scepticism, making it clear he believed the truth was far more sinister. Celeste, still guarding the wooden box, felt the pressure mount with each passing hour. De Valois was relentless, his questions weaving through the house staff, though never directly touching Celeste. Yet, she knew it was only a matter of time. She needed to understand the contents of Émile's secret, to comprehend the power held within that parchment, and the meaning behind the faded flower and the pale blonde hair. Only then, she believed, could she truly understand why Émile had been silenced, and perhaps how to protect herself from the same fate. Madame Dubois, meanwhile, had retreated further into her own private sorrow. De Valois' arrival seemed to have intensified her grief, stripping away the last vestiges of her composure. Celeste often found her staring out at the gardens, her hands clasped, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. One afternoon, Celeste was dusting the study, a room rarely used by Master Dubois, filled with scient, leather-bound volumes and the scent of aged paper and pipe tobacco. She noticed a small, locked cabinet tucked away in a shadowed corner, one she had never been asked to clean before. Her gaze was drawn to it, a prickle of intuition guiding her. Later that day, as the sun began its descent, casting long purple shadows across the veranda, Celeste saw Madame Dubois slip out of the house. She moved with a furtive grace, heading not towards the main gardens, but towards a neglected, overgrown section behind the kitchens where a small crumbling conservatory stood, half hidden by climbing vines. Celeste, driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, followed at a discreet distance. The conservatory was a forgotten relic, its glass panes cracked, its iron frame rusted. Inside, however, a surprising vibrancy remained. Exotic plants, long untended, thrived in the humid air, their leaves brushing against the dusty glass. Madame Dubois knelt amidst a bed of wilting orchids, her fingers gently touching a fragile bloom. Celeste watched, hidden by a tangle of jasmine, as Madame Dubois opened a small, tarnished silver locket she wore around her neck. Inside, Celeste glimpsed a tiny, pressed flower, its colour a deep, almost luminous indigo, the same colour as the flower in Émile's box. A jolt of understanding, cold and sharp, went through Celeste. The indigo flower was not just a random memento. It held a specific personal significance to Madame Dubois. But what was its connection to Émile? And why was Madame Dubois so secretive about it? That night, Celeste's mind raced. The locked cabinet in the study, the indigo flower in Madame Dubois's locket, the conservatory, they coalesced into a single compelling path. The next morning, feigning a need for specific cleaning supplies, Celeste found herself alone in the study once more. Her heart hammered as she approached the cabinet. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. The key, she realized, must have been Ian left in haste. She gently pulled the ornate handle. Inside, among dusty ledgers of plantation accounts and forgotten correspondence, she found it. A thick, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate design of intertwined leaves and flowers. It was heavier than she expected, and when she opened it, the scent of dried herbs and old paper filled the air. This was no ordinary accounting ledger. This was a botanist's ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous sketches of plants, some familiar, others utterly alien, accompanied by elegant, looping French script. Celeste, with her limited literacy, could still decipher some of the common names: jasmine, rose, orchidee. But her eyes were drawn to specific entries, marked with a small, stylized indigo flower in the margin. One particular entry, near the middle of the book, stood out. It was dated many years prior, roughly around the time Émile would have been a young boy, perhaps even before his arrival at Belle Rêve. The accompanying sketch was of the indigo plant, but below it the script was more detailed, more personal, almost like a diary entry. Celeste struggled with the words, her brow furrowed in concentration. She could pick out phrases. Mon secret jardin, la fleur bleue, un cadeau, son nom. My secret garden, the blue flower, a gift. His name. Then, a name written in a different, bolder hand, almost scrawled as an annotation. Émile. Celeste gasped, a silent, sharp intake of breath. Émile. His name, not as a slave, but as a person, connected to a secret garden and a blue flower. And then, below Émile's name, another, even more cryptic note, penned in a tiny, almost microscopic script. La marque de l'Empereur. The mark of the Emperor. Her mind reeled. The indigo flower, Madame Dubois's locket, Émile's box, and now this ledger, revealing a secret garden, and the mark of the Emperor. The royal crest on the parchment flashed in her mind. Could this mark of the Emperor be connected to the crest, to Émile's distinguished lineage? Was Madame Dubois involved in Émile's past, in his true identity, in a way Master Dubois could never have imagined? The ledger contained more than botanical notes. It held a hidden narrative, a coded history. It was a chronicle of a secret life, one intertwined with plants and flowers, and ultimately with Émile himself. Celeste carefully closed the ledger, her hands trembling. She had found a new piece of the impossible secret, one that implicated Madame Dubois in a way that was both startling and terrifying. The botanist's ledger was a silent, powerful witness, and Celeste knew with a chilling certainty that its pages held the key not only to Émile's identity and his murder, but also to the fragile, dangerous truth of Belle Rêve itself. She had to find out what the mark of the Emperor truly meant, and what role Madame Dubois played in this deadly, unfolding drama. The botanist's ledger, hidden once more beneath the loose floorboard, pulsed with a dangerous energy in Celeste's mind. The indigo flower, Madame Dubois's locket, Émile's name, and that cryptic phrase, La marque de l'Empereur. Each element was a thread, weaving a tapestry of secrets far more intricate and perilous than she had imagined. Madame Dubois, the seemingly meek mistress of Belle Rêve, was no longer just a grieving woman. She was a keeper of a profound secret, one that directly tied her to Émile's impossible past. Armand de Valois, meanwhile, continued his quiet, relentless inquisition. He moved through the house with the predatory grace of a panther, his piercing blue eyes missing nothing, He engaged Master Dubois in polite but pointed conversations, subtly dissecting the official story of Émile's accident. Dubois, under this sustained pressure, began to fray at the edges. His temper, always volatile, now erupted with startling frequency, directed at anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. The house, already tense, became a crucible of fear and suppressed anger. The field hands, usually stoic in their suffering, began to show subtle signs of unrest. Whispers, low and urgent, carried on the breeze from the distant cane fields. The rhythm of their work songs grew heavier, imbued with a new, somber defiance. Émile's death, initially a source of terror, was slowly transforming into a catalyst. The arrival of a white man from France, openly questioning Master Dubois's narrative, had ignited a spark of dangerous hope among some, and a deepening resentment among others. They watched de Valois, their gazes wary but curious, wondering if his presence might, against all odds, bring justice or merely a new form of oppression. Celeste observed these shifts with a growing sense of dread and urgency. She knew the power of the secret she held. If Émile truly possessed a noble lineage, if he was connected to an emperor, then his murder was not just a plantation tragedy. It was a political act, reverberating with the echoes of distant European power struggles. And if that truth were to escape, it could ignite a fire far greater than Belle Rêve could contain. She needed to understand La marque de l'Empereur. Her limited French, gleaned from overhearing Master Dubois's lessons to his son, was insufficient. But she had seen the crest on the parchment, a lion rampant, crowned, holding a fleur-de-lis, a monarchical symbol. Could the Emperor refer to Napoleon? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The name Napoleon, even whispered, carried immense weight. Yet a legacy of revolution and empire that had shaken the world. One evening, as Celeste served dinner to de Valois and a visibly agitated Dubois, she paid closer attention than usual to their conversation. De Valois, with a practiced ease, steered the discussion towards French history. The legacy of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte continues to cast a long shadow, does it not, Monsieur Dubois? He mused, swirling the wine in his glass. Even here, in your Louisiana, once a part of his vast empire. Dubois grunted, clearly uncomfortable. A shadow best left in the past, Monsieur de Valois. We have our own concerns here. De Valois smiled, a cold, knowing expression. Indeed. But history has a way of repeating itself, or rather, of refusing to be buried, especially when matters of bloodline and inheritance are involved. The Emperor, for all his ambition, left behind a complicated family tree, full of branches that extended into unexpected places. He glanced pointedly at Dubois. Then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze flickered towards Madame Dubois, who sat silently, picking at her food. Celeste felt a surge of understanding. The Emperor was Napoleon, and Émile, with his impossible secret, was connected to him. This was not merely a noble lineage, it was one that touched upon the most powerful and controversial figure in recent European history. The scandal de Valois had spoken of would be immense, capable of rocking the foundations of French society. Later that night, as a tropical storm brewed in the distance, sending gusts of wind rattling the shutters, Celeste crept back to the study. She knew it was a dangerous risk, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place, and she felt an urgent need to confirm her suspicions. She retrieved the botanist's ledger and, by the dim light of a stolen candle, pored over the entry marked with the indigo flower. La marque de l'Empereur. She traced the words with her finger, and beneath it, a tiny, almost hidden detail she had missed before, a small, almost imperceptible symbol scrawled next to Émile's name, a bee. The imperial bee, a symbol famously adopted by Napoleon to represent his empire and his dynasty. Her breath hitched. The confirmation was stark, undeniable. Émile, the beautiful male slave of Belle Rêve, was connected to Napoleon Bonaparte. This was not just a secret. It was an explosive truth, a direct challenge to the very institution of slavery and the social order of both Louisiana and France. His existence alone would have been a scandal. His claim to any lineage, however distant, would be a political earthquake. The rumblings Celeste had felt were not just the distant thunder of the approaching storm, nor merely the simmering discontent of the enslaved population. They were the tremors of a much larger upheaval, a clash between the brutal realities of plantation life and the powerful forgotten echoes of European history. Émile had been murdered not just for a claim to money, but to bury a truth that could dismantle reputations, redraw power lines, and perhaps even inspire rebellion beyond the cane fields. Celeste looked at the ledger, then at the small wooden box she had placed beside it. The parchment, the crest, the blonde hair, the indigo flower, they were all fragments of Émile's extraordinary, impossible identity. She understood now why his secret was so deadly, and she knew with a chilling certainty that de Valois was not merely seeking documents. He was hunting for a ghost, a living embodiment of a past that refused to stay buried. And she, Celeste, was now holding the very heart of that dangerous ghost in her hands, caught irrevocably between the storm brewing outside and the tempest raging within Belle Rêve. The storm that had threatened the previous night had passed, leaving Belle Rêve sweltering under a renewed oppress. "I've heat." But the true tempest continued to rage within the house. Armand de Valois' quiet inquiries had chipped away at Master Dubois's composure, revealing the raw nerve of fear beneath his bluster. Dubois, now a constant presence in the study with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, seemed to shrink with each passing hour. His eyes bloodshot, his movements jerky. The truth of Émile's lineage, the imperial bee, the connection to Napoleon Bonaparte, felt like a physical weight, pressing down on Celeste, demanding action, demanding revelation. The knowledge that Émile's murder was not merely an act of brutality, but a desperate attempt to bury a seismic secret hardened Celeste's resolve. She was no longer just a frightened girl. She was a guardian of a truth that could shatter the very foundations of this world. But who was the killer? De Valois' presence had confirmed the why, but the who remained elusive, a shadow lurking in the periphery. Her thoughts turned to the overseers, men who wielded unchecked power, whose cruelty was a daily reality. Among them, one figure stood out in her memory, a man named Silas. Silas was not merely brutal, he possessed a particular unsettling intensity, a gaze that lingered too long, a temper that flared with an almost personal venom, especially when directed at Émile. Celeste had always noticed the way Silas watched Émile. It wasn't the casual surveillance of an overseer, but something more possessive, more predatory. When Émile had been in the fields, Silas had driven him harder than the others, his whip whistling dangerously close, his shouts laced with a chilling undertone. When Émile was brought into the house, Silas's resentment had simmered, a dark, palpable jealousy that Celeste, with her keen observations, had felt like a chill in the air. He seemed to begrudge Émile's beauty, his grace, the unusual attention Master Dubois paid him. It was a silent, festering anger that went beyond, and the typical master-slave dynamic. She remembered an incident months ago when Émile had accidentally spilled a tray of drinks on a guest. Master Dubois, instead of his usual immediate fury, had merely dismissed Émile with a sharp word, a rare moment of restraint. But Silas, witnessing the scene, had been incandescent with rage, his face contorted. He had muttered threats under his breath, threats Celeste had overheard about breaking Émile, about putting him back in his place. He had hated Émile's perceived favoured status, his very existence as something beautiful and, in Silas's twisted mind, defiant. Since Émile's disappearance and subsequent discovery, Silas had been unusually quiet. His usual bluster was replaced by a grim, almost watchful silence. He still rode the fields, barking orders, but his eyes, when they met Celeste's, held a strange, unsettling glint, a mixture of triumph and unease. He had been the first on the scene after Thomas's scream, the one who had quickly declared it an accident, dismissing any further investigation with a chilling finality. One afternoon, as Celeste was hanging laundry to dry in the blistering sun, she saw Silas near the edge of the cane field where Émile's body had been found. He wasn't working, nor was he supervising. He stood alone, staring into the dense green wall of cane, his back to her. There was something in his posture, a rigid stillness, a coiled tension that caught her attention. He reached down slowly and picked something up from the ground. He examined it for a moment, then, with a furtive glance around, tucked it into his pocket. Celeste's heart pounded. She couldn't see what it was, but the secretive gesture, the way he seemed to be drawn back to the scene of Émile's death, spoke volumes. It was not the behavior of a man who believed it was a simple accident. It was the behavior of a man with a secret. That evening, as dusk settled, Celeste made a dangerous decision. She needed to know what Silas had found. She knew his habits. After his evening meal, he would often go to the small, dilapidated shed he used as an office, to tally accounts, or simply brood over a bottle of cheap liquor. Under the cloak of deepening twilight, Celeste crept towards the shed. The air was thick with the droning of cicadas and the distant croaking of frogs from the swamp. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The shed door was ajar, a sliver of candlelight visible through the crack. She pressed her ear to the rough wood. She could hear Silas inside, grunting, the clink of a bottle. Then, a rustle of paper. Celeste risked a peek through a knot-hole in the wood. Silas sat at a rickety table, a half-empty bottle beside him. In his hand, he held a small dark object. It was a small, intricately carved bird, the one Émile had been working on, the one Celeste had seen on his bedside table in his room. It was not Émile's, she realized with a jolt. It was his. But Silas wasn't looking at the bird. His gaze was fixed on something else, something he had laid out on the table. It was a single dried flower, an indigo flower, its petals faded but still discernible. The same color as the flower in Émile's box, the same color as the flower in Madame Dubois' locket, the same color that marked the entries in the botanist's ledger. Silas picked up the flower, his rough thumb stroking its delicate petals with an unsettling tenderness. His eyes, usually hard and cruel, held a complex expression, a mix of longing, resentment, and a chilling satisfaction. He then unfolded a small, brittle piece of paper, smaller than the parchment in Émile's box, but clearly old. Celeste could not read the script, but she saw something else. A tiny, faded drawing, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, of a bee. The imperial bee. A cold wave of dread washed over Celeste. Silas had not just found something at the scene. He had possessed this knowledge for a long time. His obsession with Émile was far deeper, far more twisted than mere jealousy. He knew about the indigo flower. He knew about the bee. He knew Émile's secret. And he had been holding on to it, perhaps even before Émile's death. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas's rage, his possessiveness, his quiet triumph after Émile's death. He hadn't just hated Émile. He had wanted him, in a way Celeste could not fully comprehend, but recognized as dangerous. And Émile's secret, the mark of the Emperor, had somehow become intertwined with that obsession. Silas had known who Émile truly was, or at least knew enough to connect him to the imperial symbol. Celeste pulled back from the shed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The killer was no longer a shadow. The killer was Silas, the overseer, driven by a dark, possessive obsession and the knowledge of Émile's impossible secret. He hadn't just stumbled upon Émile's death. He had orchestrated it, perhaps to possess the secret, perhaps to silence Émile, or perhaps simply to break him completely. And now, Celeste had seen his evidence, the very proof of his guilt. The danger had intensified 1,000-fold. The knowledge of Silas's guilt lay heavy and cold in Celeste's stomach, a toxic lump that hardened her resolve even as it filled her with dread. The overseer, not some shadowy figure from Émile's past, but a man of immediate brutal power on Bel Rêve, had murdered Émile. His dark obsession, fueled by Émile's impossible secret and the symbol of the imperial bee, had culminated in a fatal act of possessive violence. Celeste had seen the evidence in his hands, in his eyes, and now she carried the crushing weight of that truth. The danger was no longer abstract. It was personified in Silas, a man capable of unspeakable acts, and she knew he would not hesitate to silence anyone who threatened his secret. Telling Armand de Valois felt like a gamble. She had no tangible proof, only observations and instincts. Her word, a slave's word, against that of an overseer, a white man, would carry little weight, and might only put her in greater peril. She needed more. She needed undeniable proof. Silas, oblivious to Celeste's discovery, moved through the plantation with a heightened, almost frantic energy. His usual surliness was replaced by a twitchy vigilance. His gaze swept over the field hands, lingering on the house staff, as if searching for a phantom. He spent more time alone, riding the perimeter of the cane fields, especially near the area where Émile's body had been found. He was either looking for something he had missed, or ensuring nothing remained that could implicate him. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly, Celeste saw Silas cinch his saddle and ride not towards the distant fields, but towards the river bend. It was a secluded, treacherous stretch of the Mississippi, notorious for its thick, almost impenetrable cypress swamps, its murky backwaters and its treacherous currents. It was a place where things could disappear, swallowed by the dense foliage and the hungry river. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was where he would go if he had something to hide, something to dispose of. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Celeste slipped away from her duties. She followed him, keeping to the shadows of the tree line, her bare feet silent on the damp earth. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of stagnant water, decaying leaves, and the cloying sweetness of jasmine. The drone of insects was deafening, a constant hum that seemed to press in on her, amplifying her fear. She found Silas at the very edge of the river bend, where the gnarled roots of ancient cypress trees plunged into the dark water. He was not on his horse. He stood hunched over, near a patch of disturbed earth, digging furiously with a small, rusted shovel. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face slick with sweat and grim determination. He seemed to be unearthing something or burying it deeper. Celeste hid behind a thick tangle of vines, her breath caught in her throat. She watched as Silas finally unearthed a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. He tore away the coarse fabric, revealing a dark, heavy object. It was a crude, heavy iron club, stained with what looked like dried mud and something darker, more ominous. The murder weapon. As Silas stared at the club, a look of twisted triumph and something akin to sorrow crossed his face. He lifted it, weighing it in his hand, a chilling smile playing on his lips. "You thought you were so clever, didn't you, pretty boy?" he muttered, his voice a low, guttural growl, carried faintly on the breeze. "With your fancy talk and your fine ways. Your secrets? Always looking down on me, even when you were chained like the rest. Master Dubois' little pet. But I showed you, didn't I? I showed you what happens when you think you're better than Silas." He paused, his eyes fixed on the club. "That little bee, that flower. You thought they made you special, made you untouchable. They just made you a target. And I was the one who made sure your secret died with you. No one would ever know. No one would ever take you from me." His words, laced with a terrifying blend of possessiveness and resentment, sent a shiver down Celeste's spine. It was not just about the secret. It was about Émile himself, about Silas's desperate, twisted desire for control. Just as Silas raised the club, as if to finally cast it into the churning river, a dry twig snapped under Celeste's foot. Silas froze, his head snapped up, his eyes, wild and bloodshot, scanning the dense foliage. He saw her, a flicker of movement in the shadows, his face contorted, the brief moment of morbid satisfaction replaced by a surge of pure, murderous rage. "Who's there?" he roared, his voice echoing through the silent woods. "Show yourself!" Celeste knew she was caught. There was no escape. She pushed through the vines, stepping out into the dappled sunlight, her hands trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silas's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with a terrifying certainty. "You!" he hissed, the club still clutched in his hand, its dark, heavy head glinting ominously. The little shadow, always watching, always listening. You know, don't you? You know about Émile, about the club, about the secret. He took a step towards her, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. That pretty boy, he thought he could fool everyone. But I saw him. I saw the flower, the bee. He showed me the parchment, thought he could use it to bargain for his freedom, to leave this place, to leave me. But I knew better. That secret was mine to keep, not his to flaunt. He was close now, his breath heavy, smelling of liquor and sweat. Celeste could see the madness in his eyes, the terrifying conviction of his twisted logic. He had not just killed Émile. He had wanted to possess his entire being, his secret, his fate. And now, Celeste held the key to unraveling his carefully constructed lie. "You won't tell anyone," Silas snarled, raising the iron club. "No one will ever know. Just like Émile, you'll disappear, swallowed by the river. And his secret, it will stay buried, just like him. Just like you." Celeste stared at the rising club, her mind racing, searching desperately for an escape. The river, dark and foreboding, churned behind Silas. The dense woods offered no immediate refuge. She was trapped, face to face with a killer, at the very spot where Émile's impossible secret had been violently silenced. Her life and the fate of Émile's truth hung precariously in the balance. Silas's shadow loomed, distorted and monstrous in the fading light, as the heavy iron club arced upwards, a dark, lethal promise. Celeste's breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror, bracing for the inevitable impact. The river's murmur, the cicada's drone, the distant croak of a frog, all sounds seemed to sharpen, then vanish, leaving only the deafening thud of her own heart. Just as the club began its descent, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the stillness, resonant with a chilling French accent. "Silas! Drop the weapon!" Silas froze. The club arrested mid-air, inches from Celeste's head. His head snapped around, his eyes, still wild, searching the tree line. Armand de Valois emerged from the shadows, a dark, imposing figure, a small, gleaming pistol held steadily in his gloved hand, aimed directly at Silas's chest. His blue eyes were cold, unwavering. "I warned you, Monsieur Dubois' man," de Valois stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "that I would uncover the truth. It seems I have found a significant piece of it here, at the river's edge." Silas's face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred, a mix of fury and trapped desperation. "You! Always poking your nose where it don't belong! This ain't your concern, Frenchman. This is Belle Rêve business." "Émile's death is very much my concern," de Valois countered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "And this young woman's life, it seems, is now intertwined with it. Drop the club, Silas. Now." The air crackled with tension. Silas, caught between his murderous rage and the cold, unyielding threat of de Valois' pistol, hesitated. His gaze flickered from Celeste to the club, then to de Valois. For a moment Celeste feared he would lunge, choosing a final, desperate act of violence. But the glint in de Valois' eyes was absolute. Silas's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. With a grunt of defeat, he let the iron club fall from his grasp. It landed in the soft earth with a dull thud. De Valois gestured with the pistol. "To your knees, Silas." Slowly. Silas obeyed, sinking to the ground, his eyes still burning with venom. Celeste, her legs trembling, found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "He killed Émile, Monsieur de Valois. He had the club. He confessed. He knew about the flower, about the bee." De Valois' gaze shifted to Celeste, a flicker of something akin to respect in his eyes. "The flower? The bee?" Celeste, despite her terror, felt a surge of empowerment. This was her moment, her chance to lay bare the impossible secret. "Yes, monsieur. In Émile's room I found a box, and in that box a parchment with a crest, and a dried indigo flower, and a lock of pale hair. And in Master Dubois's study I found a ledger, a botanist's ledger, belonging to Madame Dubois. It spoke of a secret garden, an indigo flower, and Émile's name was there, marked with La Marque de l'Empereur, the imperial bee." De Valois' expression remained impassive, but Celeste saw a subtle tightening around his eyes, a confirmation of his deepest suspicions. "The imperial bee," he repeated, almost to himself. So it is true. He carried the proof. He turned his gaze back to Silas, his voice sharper now. So, Silas, you knew. You knew Émile's true connection. Is that why you killed him? To bury the secret, to stop him from revealing his lineage? Silas said.
Pat, his face contorted. He was going to leave. He showed me the paper, the bee, talking about some grand family in France, saying he'd be free, saying he'd be rich. He thought he was better than us, better than me. He thought he could just walk away after everything. But he was mine. He was Master Dubois's property, and he was mine to keep in line. His voice rose to a frenzied pitch. I beat him. I showed him. He wouldn't listen. He kept talking about that damned paper. He said he'd expose all of us, expose Master Dubois, Madame Dubois, everyone. So I silenced him. I smashed his pretty face in, and I threw the paper in the river. No one would ever know. Celeste gasped, a fresh wave of horror washing over her. The parchment, the proof of Émile's lineage, thrown into the river. All this time, she had guarded a copy, a fragment, while the original lay lost. De Valois' face was grim. You threw the original document into the river? His voice was low, dangerous. Silas merely laughed, a ragged, broken sound. Gone! All of it gone. No fancy French family will ever claim him now. He's just a dead slave in the cane field, just like he should be. Suddenly, another figure emerged from the shadows, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with shock and grief. It was Madame Dubois. She had followed, drawn by the commotion, her silent sorrow now erupting into a keening wail. She rushed towards Silas, her delicate hands surprisingly strong, as she clutched his arm. Silas! How could you? Émile! My Émile! She sobbed, her voice choked with anguish. She turned to de Valois, her gaze pleading. He was my son. My son. My brother Jean-Luc. He was a botanist. He fell in love with a beautiful woman, a slave on another plantation, before she was sold to Dubois. He sent her away, pregnant, to hide the shame, but she came back to me in secret. Émile was born here in the conservatory, my secret child, my brother's legacy. The indigo flower was our symbol, his father's favorite. Dubois bought him from the New Orleans market years later, never knowing he was his own wife's nephew. Émile found his father's letters, the parchment, the proof of his heritage, the connection to my family, to the Emperor's court through a distant relative. He tried to bargain with Silas, to escape, but Silas was obsessed with him. He loved Émile in his own twisted way. He couldn't bear for him to leave, to be free, to be someone else's. The truth, impossible and devastating, unfurled in the moonlight. Émile was not merely connected to a noble French family, but was Madame Dubois' nephew, Master Dubois' enslaved relative, his very existence a monumental scandal that threatened to unravel the entire plantation. Silas's obsession was not just jealousy, but a dark, possessive love, twisted into murder. De Valois lowered his pistol, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Silas on his knees, Madame Dubois sobbing, Celeste standing, witness to a truth that transcended all boundaries. The imperial bee, the indigo flower, the pale blonde hair. They were all fragments of a love story, a secret lineage, and a brutal murder. The original parchment may be lost, de Valois said, his voice now thoughtful. But the truth, it seems, has found its way to the surface nonetheless, and it is far more scandalous than even I imagined. He looked at Celeste, then back at the river. The river may swallow the paper, but it cannot swallow the tale. Celeste clutched her own hidden wooden box, its contents now more precious and perilous than ever. The impossible secret had been revealed, not in a grand court, but in the swampy shadows of Belle Rêve, under the watchful eye of the moon. And now, with Silas exposed and the truth laid bare, the real consequences for Belle Rêve, for Madame Dubois, and for Celeste herself
were about to begin. The final act was upon them. The moon, a pale sliver above the Louisiana cypress, bore silent witness to the shattering of Belrève's gilded illusion. Silas, disarmed and broken, knelt in the mud, his murderous rage having curdled into a bitter, defeated silence. Madame Dubois, her face streaked with tears and grime, clung to the raw truth of her nephew's murder, her long-held secret finally exposed. Armand de Valois, pistol still steady, surveyed the scene, his aristocratic features etched with a grim satisfaction. The impossible secret of Émile, the beautiful male slave with an imperial lineage, had finally been dragged into the brutal light. De Valois wasted no time. With a crisp command, he ordered Silas secured. Two of the field hands, drawn by the commotion and now emboldened by the presence of the Frenchman and the sight of their overseer defeated, moved forward, their faces grim but resolute. They bound Silas's hands, their movements rough, a lifetime of suppressed anger finding a legal outlet in this moment. The overseer, once untouchable, was now a prisoner, his reign of terror over. De Valois made it clear that Silas would be taken to Baton Rouge, not to be dismissed quietly, but to face charges that would be pressed with the full weight of French diplomatic influence, implicating him not just in the murder of a slave, but in the silencing of a potential claimant to a prestigious, albeit controversial lineage. The impact on Master Dubois was swift and devastating. Awakened by the commotion, he stumbled upon the scene, his brandy-soaked mind struggling to comprehend the tableau before him. His own wife weeping openly, confessing her nephew's identity, the imperial bee, the botanist's ledger. It all crashed down upon him. His own wife had harbored a secret child of nobility, a nephew whom he had unknowingly enslaved and whose death he had covered up. The scandal would not merely ruin him, it would utterly annihilate his standing in Baton Rouge society and beyond. His fortune, his reputation, his very identity as a powerful planter would be irrevocably tainted by the revelation of his wife's family connection to a Bonapartist claim and the murder of his own relative. He collapsed onto the damp earth, a broken man, his empire of cruelty crumbling around him. Madame Dubois, stripped bare of her secrets, found a strange, fragile strength in her grief. She confessed everything to de Valois, detailing her brother Jean-Luc's clandestine love affair, the birth of Émile in the hidden conservatory, her desperate attempts to protect him, and the agonizing decision to allow Dubois to purchase him, never imagining he would fall victim to Silas's twisted obsession. Her tears flowed freely now, not just for Émile, but for the decades of suppressed truth and the suffocating weight of her own complicity. De Valois listened intently, his expression unreadable. He knew the original parchment was lost to the river, but Celeste's testimony, combined with Madame Dubois's confession and the evidence of the botanist's ledger, painted a clear, undeniable picture. The lock of pale blonde hair, the indigo flower, they were more than sentimental tokens. They were threads connecting Émile to a specific branch of the Bonapartist diaspora, a lineage that, while inconvenient and potentially scandalous, and still held enough sway to warrant de Valois' journey. Celeste, holding the wooden box, felt a new sense of purpose. She presented it to de Valois, explaining its contents. The remaining fragments of the parchment, the detailed drawings of the imperial bee in the ledger, and Madame Dubois' own locket with the indigo flower, served as powerful corroborating evidence. De Valois examined them carefully, his lips pressed into a thin line. Émile's claim, though perhaps not legally enforceable in a French court without the original documents, was now undeniable in the court of truth. His existence, his murder, and the powerful secrets he carried would not be forgotten. For Celeste, this night marked not an end, but a beginning. De Valois, recognizing her courage and her pivotal role in uncovering the truth, made an offer that transcended the boundaries of Belrève. He would ensure her freedom and arrange for her passage to New Orleans, where she could seek a new life, unburdened by the chains of slavery. He saw in her not just a servant, but a keen observer, a keeper of dangerous knowledge, and a woman who deserved more than the brutal realities of the plantation. The dawn that broke over Belle Reve was unlike any before. The air still hung heavy, but it was now charged with the potent scent of change. Master Dubois was swiftly disgraced, his properties seized, his name a byword for scandal and depravity. Belle Reve, stripped of its cruel master, began a slow, painful process of transformation. Madame Dubois, though forever marked by her grief and the weight of her secrets, found a measure of peace in the confession. She retreated from society, dedicating her remaining years to tending her brother's conservatory, a living memorial to Émile and the hidden beauty he represented. Silas faced a brutal justice, not just from the French consul's intervention, but from the very system he had upheld. His crimes, once dismissed, were now magnified by the imperial connection, making him a convenient scapegoat for the larger societal ills. His fate, though not a triumph of universal justice, was a stark warning to others. Celeste left Belle Reve a few weeks later, carrying her small wooden box, a symbol of the secrets she had guarded and the freedom she had earned. She walked away from the cane fields, from the whispers of the past, towards the bustling streets of New Orleans, a city of new possibilities. She knew the fight for true justice, for all, was far from over. But Émile's impossible secret, though it had cost him his life, had not died with him. It had ignited a spark, revealed a truth, and ultimately paved the way for a new dawn, not just for her, but for the nascent stirrings of change in the heart of Baton Rouge, a quiet testament to the beautiful slave who changed everything. His legacy, once buried, now bloomed, as resilient and vibrant as the indigo flower. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking through the shadows with me. Stories like this linger, not because of ghosts, but because of the truths people tried so hard to bury. Émile's secret never should have reached Louisiana, and yet, even in death, it forced its way into the light. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you believe Belle Reve was cursed by history, or by the people who tried to control it? And as always, stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next Lost Vel Chronicle.